Let's trace through a recursive function that builds a list. And in this case, we are going to write a function named double that is given a list of numbers, and when it is given a list of numbers, it will return back to us a list of numbers with the expectation that all of the numbers in this list will be doubled. We can tell that this is a recursive function because inside of the function we see that there is a function call to the function itself. So let's take a look at it. This is a function that builds a list recursively. The base case that we can tend to care about when we're processing a list recursively is if we've reached an empty list. And in this case, if we give you an empty list of numbers, we're going to give you back an empty list of numbers. Right? So if we give double an empty list of numbers, it's going to give us back an empty list of numbers. Otherwise, the pattern that we use when we're building a list recursively is first do what we want to do to process the first element. Process the first element. And here what we're doing is we are multiplying the first element by 2. Right? So we're saying 2 times the first element of the list will be stored in this variable x. The second important part of building a list recursively is we are going to cons the processed first element, so cons first element, onto the natural recursion of the rest of the list, or onto the rest of the list processed recursively in the same way. And so we'll take a look at what this actually means when this gets processed by the computer step by step. Right? But the idea here is we are going to move through the rest of the list recursively using this double function, and at each point we are processing the first element onto the rest of the list processed recursively. This is kind of like moving people through a line and into the next place. So let's think through how this actually works. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reveal a main function here that uses this in a very simple way. So let me set up some space to sort of visualize what is it that, as this function is being as this program is being processed by the computer, what is it the computer sees? Well, our program begins with this call to main. And the main function is going to set up, it's going to get started by declaring a variable named nums. So let nums be a list of numbers. And that's all we're doing here. So I'm going to set up another sort of space in this computer's view of the world for memory. Right? So in memory, in the main function, we're setting up a variable named nums, and this is going to hold a list of numbers, so I'm going to make this a big box to hold some numbers in. Later we'll learn exactly how this gets stored in memory in more detail, but for now let's just assume that we've got a big box that we'll be able to put a list of numbers in. And we've declared this variable nums, we're ready to go to the next line. So nums is assigned the result of calling listify with arguments 1, 2. We're not going to follow this function call through and through, but the idea here is we're going to think about what happens when the computer processes the listify function. Well, it's going to call the listify function, and we know that the listify function is going to substitute back where this function was called a list whose values are those arguments in the same order. So this will give us back a list of 1 to null. All right, so this will be processed to the list 1 to null. We're saying take that list and assign it to nums. So now in memory, the nums variable is going to have 1 to null in it. All right. This assignment statement has been completed. So we're ready to move to the very next line. And the very next line is saying print the result of calling the double function with nums. So print double, and nums is going here. All right, so when the computer goes to evaluate this, we're going to start from the inside out. Well, this nums variable is referring to the nums in memory, and that's going to be substituted with 1 to null. All right, and so now we've reached this call to the double function. with 1 to null as our argument. So we're going to drop a bookmark, and we're going to say, all right, let's go figure out what is double with the argument 1 to null. And to figure this out, the first step that we're going to always take when we call a function is we're going to assign to our parameter the corresponding argument. All right, so here the parameter is named list, and so we need to set up some space to hold our list. And the list that we are trying to figure out, or trying to process using this double function, is 1 to null. All right, now that we have assigned our arguments, we are ready to jump into this function and work through it. So if list is equal to null, let's imagine what happens when the computer reaches this line. So it's trying to evaluate if list is equal to null. Well, we know list is the list 1 to null for the purposes of this function call. So it's first going to see, all right, well, 1 to null. And is the list of 1 to null equal to null? No. So this is false. And we have a statement, an if-then statement, where the condition is false. We know that when this Boolean expression is false, that means we are going to jump over the then block and enter the else block. So the very next line of code that we need to run in this double function is this one. So we are saying let x be a number variable that is assigned the result of 2 times the first value of our list. All right, so let's figure out, let's work through the right-hand side of this variable declaration and assignment statement first. So what is the first value of our list? Normally we would substitute list in here, but rather than do that, we know that the first value of this list is 1, so I'm just going to substitute this call of first to with a value of 1. Now we've got 2 times 1, we know that that is just 2. Now we're saying assign 2 to the variable we're declaring named x. So let me make some space in memory to store x, and x has a value of 2 in it. All right, we've completed this variable declaration and assignment line. We're ready to move to the very next line of this function. The very next line of this function is more of a doozy. We've got a return statement where we are returning the cons of x with double called recursively on the rest of the list. And so let's work through this piece by piece. All right, so where do we want to start? Let's start with substituting this x variable. X is currently 2, so we can make that substitution. And now we need to work our way in from the innermost parentheses out. So list is this list 1, 2. Normally we would substitute list directly in here, but for space purposes, let's go ahead and think about what is the rest of this list. Well, the rest of this list is just 2 null. So let me substitute 2 null in here. All right. So 2 null is the rest of that list. And in order to figure out what to do next, or what this list will evaluate to, we need to call this double function. So notice we need to drop our bookmark and call double recursively once again. So we're now going to be trying to figure out what is double of the list 2 null. This is yet again another function call. So what do we need to do? We need to assign to our parameter, our list parameter, the argument that we're being given. So our list parameter is going to have some values in it. It's going to have the value 2 null. This is the list that we just passed to it. And we've passed our arguments, so we're ready to begin processing this function. If list is equal to null. So the computer is going to say, all right, if list is equal to null. Well, what is list? List is 2 null. We can substitute that. And the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to ask, is this true or false? Well, this is false. All right. And so if we reach an if statement where the expression is false, we know that we're going to skip the then block, and the very next line of code that we need to process is this one. Let x be a number variable that is 2 times the first value of this list. So let x be a number variable that is 2 times the first value of this list. All right. Well, we need to figure out what's the first value of this list. It is just 2. so 2 times 2 is going to be 4. So the computer is going to boil this down to a single value. Now that it's a single value, we can assign this to x. And this is also declaring x. So let's set up a variable in memory for x. X is now assigned 4, or initialized to 4. All right, we've completed this line. We're ready to move on to the very next line. The very next line is this return statement. And so now we need to return the result of calling the cons function with x and double the rest of the list. So here we are following that rule. When we're building up a list recursively, what we do is we cons the very first element onto the recursion of the rest of the list, or calling this function, building up this list recursively by applying the same process to the rest of the list. Well, let's go ahead and substitute here. The rest of this list is just null. Right? The rest of 2 null is null. And x we know is 4. This is all we can do. We now need to go figure out, well, what's the result of calling double with null? So we're going to drop our bookmark, and we go up to the top, and we're going to make some new space for calling double with the empty list, double with null. And what do we do first when we call a function? Well, we set up some space in memory for our parameters. So the list parameter is assigned null. Right? So list is our parameter, and it was assigned the argument we passed to it for this function call. And we're ready to begin back at the top. Well, if we're trying to figure out what is double of null, we're going to ask if list is equal to null. And list is going to just be substituted with its value in this function call, which is null. If null is equal to null, we know that is true, right? Null is equal to null. And we've reached our base case, right? So if true means we are going to go to the then block, and we will not do what's in the else block. All right, so we've reached our base case. We're ready to stop recurring and start returning. So return null. Now, when we reach a return statement that has a single value at the end of it, or its expression is a single value, we replace where this function call happened with that value. So we take this null value, and we're going to replace where we left that bookmark. So we left that bookmark at double of null, and so we will say double of null was just null. It's just the empty list. All right, and we are now ready to return back to this function where we left off. We can get rid of our work for double of null, and now we're back in the function call where we call double with a list that just had 2 in it, and it's going to return cons of 4 and null. Well, what is cons of 4 and null? That's just the list with 4 in it, right? That's just a list with 4 null stored in it. And so we reached a return statement where we boil this down to a single list. We're going to take that list and return it back to the point where we left our last bookmark. So now we're saying where we called double of 2 and null, that is actually the list 4 null. And we can get rid of our work from the call above it. And we're almost all the way back to our main function. We only have a little bit more work to do. So we know that cons is going to take the first argument and add it onto the front of the rest of this list, so of the second argument. So this will be the list 2 for null. And so that's what cons 2 onto the front of the list of 4 will give us back. And this is just a return statement where we've got this list, and we're going to return it back down to our bookmark. So double of 1, 2 null is going to evaluate to the list of 2, 4 null. And we're almost back and done. And hopefully you can kind of get a sense of how the mechanics of this are coming together. So we erase all of our work from the prior function call, and we're ready to return back to main. And in main, we see that we are going to print out the list 2, 4. Nums, the nums value is still 1, 2, but after all that work, we processed and built up a list recursively, and this was the result of calling double with the list 1, 2. It gave us back a list 2, 4. So when this print statement is evaluated, it will send to the screen 2, 4, and we'll see that this function is completed and our program is done. The important thing to remember when building up a list recursively is that you always want to process the first element of the list in some way, And then if you want to add that element back to the list that you're generating, you're going to cons it onto the rest of the list processed recursively.